Today I am going to articulate a rational defense of untruths and illusions. More specifically, I am going to provide a rational defense of religion and free will. So let's get into things. Firstly, it is worth noting that I am not religious. I have in the past argued against religion on the grounds that it is irrational and irrationality is bad. I have also argued against the idea of free will, which I think is nothing more than an illusion created by our intricate and complex consciousness. I think that religion is little more than a coping mechanism designed to make up for human confusion and fear resulting from existence in an incomprehensible and terrifying world. I think free will is an illusion of intuition. These things do not seem to be true. They seem to be false. They make claims about the nature of things, and these claims just don't seem consistent with empirical evidence and rationality. They are not necessarily lies, because I feel like lying implies some kind of intent. They are instead simply untruths and illusions. They are wrong in their view of the nature of things. Most people, upon hearing this, will immediately decide that these things must be abandoned. It seems intuitive that we shouldn't believe things that aren't true. I take a different approach. I think things are a little more complex than that. First, it is necessary that I articulate my view on truth and human understandings of reality. From there, I can apply that standard to the subject at hand. Discovering the truth and understanding the nature of reality is desirable because it serves us. It is useful for us. It allows us to interact with reality in ways that are beneficial to us and allows us to build useful understandings. That is how the argument for embracing truth goes, and I accept it. Except for one tiny thing. This argument assumes truth and understanding reality is always useful. That is quite an assumption to make. The argument is that we should find truth and understand and interact with reality for what it is, because that is useful. Usefulness is the justification. Therefore, when understanding truth and reality, and living according to those understandings, is not useful, there is no longer any reason to do it. The justification is removed, and it necessarily becomes unjustified. Understanding truth and reality only matters insofar as it is useful, which sometimes it is not. I think, for example, that sometimes a comforting illusion is better than a sad despair-inducing reality. This is why I say we should choose optimism in the face of a despair-inducing world. The paradox at work here is the simple fact that it is a fact, it is a truth, it is a reality of our interest as sentient beings, that sometimes we should not live according to truth and reality. It is true that sometimes living according to a tireless obsession with the truth is actually not good for us. It is a fact that sometimes living according to the most cold, inarguable facts is not good for us. It is a fact of our reality that sometimes living according to strict material reality is not good for us. Discovering the truth means discovering the fact that we should not always follow and care about the true nature of reality. It could easily be argued that this makes that our true reality, meaning we live according to reality and truth regardless. It is just the truth that truth doesn't necessarily matter. It is just the reality that reality doesn't necessarily matter. It is just a fact that fact doesn't necessarily matter. It is quite the paradox. It is just the reality of our existence that sometimes pure material reality doesn't serve us. This seems incoherent, inconsistent, and completely absurd, but it really isn't any of those things at all. The core consistent motivator is our rational self-interest. Therefore, there is no incoherence. This view is perfectly coherent, consistent, and rational. If we follow our rational self-interest, we will find that it is a fact of our reality that sometimes accepting a comforting illusion that you know to be false is better than embracing a misery-inducing truth. This, in a sense, becomes the ultimate truth of our reality, the truth that overwhelms all other truth. The fact that usefulness is at the core of all that matters. Sometimes we should choose optimism even when pessimism seems like the right choice. We choose optimism not because it aligns with how reality tells us we should feel. It doesn't. We choose optimism because it is a fact of our sentient reality that pessimism is only going to make the world a darker place. Therefore, it is irrational to sometimes choose optimism because optimism is more useful to us. We can know that something is untrue and choose it anyway, and sometimes doing so is irrational. The truth is only valuable insofar as it serves us, and that is the ultimate truth of our sentient existence. We pursue our rational self-interest, and sometimes that means embracing reality, and sometimes it means shunning it. Reality and truth only matter insofar as they are useful, and there is absolutely no reason to believe they are always useful. Shortly, this reasoning will be applied to free will and religion. I think you can imagine how that will work. I, however, wanted to clear up one final thing. We should always understand what reality is and what is true. Then we can decide if we want to embrace it and to live according to it or not. In order for a rational actor to reject the nature of reality, they must first understand it. I know this sounds like I am advocating for cognitive dissonance. I am not. This is perfectly coherent, consistent, and rational. The foundation of all involved reasoning is the most rational form of self-interest conceivable, the purest rational self-interest. If looked at through the lens of rational self-interest, this is incredibly consistent and coherent. You can understand that something is true and then weigh the positives and negatives of accepting that truth with the positives and negatives of some alternative view to decide which one serves you better, which one is more useful, and then you can embrace that one, and if you're a rational actor, you will. We have to know what is true and what reality is so we can engage in a rational comparison of these ideas and their alternatives to decide which ones we ought to embrace. We must understand the reality so we can decide if embracing it is a good idea or not. We can understand the true nature of reality before deciding to live according to an alternative and untrue idea or understanding, if our rational consideration leads to us concluding that doing so aligns better with our rational self-interest. This isn't just about choosing one set of beliefs and sticking with them either. We can switch between truth and useful untruth whenever doing so is useful. Sometimes we may find the truth useful, and sometimes we may find an alternative untrue approach useful. It is perfectly consistent to jump between the two whenever doing so is useful for achieving our rational self-interest. There is literally nothing absurd or incoherent about this. It is all driven by the same thing: rational self-interest of the purest form. It is as coherent, consistent, and irrational as a view can possibly be. Simply weigh up and irrationally compare the untruth and a favourite illusion. Decide what one serves you better, decide what one is more useful, and embrace that one. Regularly go back to the question and pivot whenever it is convenient. Understand the truth and reality so you can know that your illusion is in fact better, but feel no guilt in embracing your illusion whenever doing so is optimal. Truth and understanding reality only matters insofar as it is useful, and sometimes it just isn't useful. Sometimes usefulness leads to the embrace of illusions and untruths. We should know the truth because sometimes it will be convenient, and because knowing the truth allows us to compare its positives and negatives with the positives and negatives of our illusions and untruths. But we can know the truth and choose to embrace an illusion, an untruth anyway, because doing so is sometimes in our rational interest. Sometimes it is most useful. This is a rational and consistent way of living. It reflects complete devotion to rational self-interest, with no foolish and harmful attachment to things that there is no need to attach ourselves to. It is, in my view, the epitome of rationality. Unflinching devotion to what is useful, with no weird attachments that get in the way of that pursuit. I hope that was enough information to give you some idea of my view on the subject of truth, reality, and usefulness. In simple terms, I think these things matter insofar as they are useful. We must know about them regardless, because that is the only way to decide if they are useful or not. After this, however, we can swiftly decide whether to embrace them or reject them. So, how does this apply to religion and free will? How is this a rational defense of religion and free will? It is quite simple, really. Religion and free will are both at odds with truth and reality, or at least they seem to be according to the current information that we have access to. But that doesn't necessarily mean these things aren't useful. That doesn't necessarily mean they need to die. We can rationally compare what seems to be the reality with these illusions. We can compare their usefulness and make a rational choice to embrace either of them. This does require understanding reality. We cannot rationally choose an illusion if we have not carefully considered the alternatives, and that includes the truth. We could, however, compare reality and illusion and decide illusion serves us better. We can decide that illusion is more useful. We can decide that illusion is worthy of embrace. This is a rational way of being religious or a believer in free will. I used to think that religion was inherently irrational. Now I think that it normally is, but it isn't inherently. Religion can be rational. The believer can know that religion is not true, but follow it to some extent anyways because they have rationally decided that it is useful. Usefulness is the ultimate arbiter. Truth only matters insofar as it is useful, meaning that if the illusion is more useful, then there is no reason not to embrace it. Religion can be rational. It most often isn't, but it can be. Religion could in some cases be more useful than atheism. In such a case it can be justified, but it must be conducted rationally. Free will can be more useful than determinism because truth only matters insofar as it is useful. This can justify us believing in free will even when we know it isn't technically true, simply because we know that it is true that sometimes untruth can be useful and therefore worthy of embrace. If usefulness gives truth value, it can also give untruth value. If usefulness determines the value of truth, then who says it cannot also determine the value of untruth? That is the greatest truth. The case of determinism and free will also represents the fact that truth and usefulness do not overlap completely, and it is foolish to assume they do. Just because free will is not true, that doesn't mean it is not useful. Just because determinism is true, that doesn't mean it is useful. These are foolish assumptions to be making. The exact same thing goes for religion. Truth and usefulness are not inherently tied, and that is the ultimate truth. This can also be brought up with matters of equality. People can be of equal ability, and that doesn't necessarily justify equality. People can be of unequal ability, and that doesn't necessarily justify inequality. More reasoning is needed here. We need to move beyond these foolish assumptions about what ought to be, which we so eagerly and naively derive from what is. We need to instead ask, what is useful? What aligns with the purest form of rational self-interest? Ask what reality is, but promptly follow this up by asking why we should care. Don't just do this once either. Do this regularly, because the usefulness of things can change over time and in a differing context. I am not religious, but I have to some extent adopted a good example of this approach when it comes to free will. I live as if I have free will every day, partially because I have no choice, but also because I choose to live as if I have free will rather than fixating on determinism. I live like this because I think doing so is useful. It allows you to keep your sanity and function like a free individual who has power and control over your life and choices. I know my behavior is just a result of factors out of my control, but if I pretend it isn't, then I will feel freer and happier. I take up the illusion without difficulty because I know it is useful. Because I know it is better than the alternative, and that is the only justification it needs. I don't care if it isn't true. It is useful, and that's all that matters. I will happily embrace an illusion, so long as I know about and have considered the alternatives, only to decide the illusion is more useful. I drag out determinism when I am trying to understand why someone else or even myself is acting in a certain way. When someone is generally unpleasant, I try to view them not as choosing to be evil, as free will would imply. I instead view them more as a victim of circumstance. I think this is a more useful view than its alternative. It allows me to sympathize with them and help them where I would otherwise have nothing but spite for them. This kind of deterministic compassion and empathy is a good thing to promote. It is good for me and the society. I do the same thing with pessimism and optimism. Reality tends to trigger pessimism in me, but I often choose optimism because without it, the world only becomes a worse place. Pessimism only makes the world worse. Even though optimism can be out of touch with reality, I sometimes adopt it anyway because it is useful. Truth, as you can see, is a very complicated thing. Truth should be known, but that does not necessarily mean it should be embraced. Usefulness is the rational measure of that, and sometimes it will say yes, and sometimes it will say no. The idea I have tried to explain here is not perfectly developed or by any means complete. It is, however, a strong and defensible worldview. It takes our current understandings to their logical conclusions. It does this by pointing out that truth is only valuable if and when it is useful. The defenders of truth will almost without failure defend it on the grounds of its usefulness. The logical implication of this is that truth that is not useful must be considered but not embraced. This worldview brings our understandings of truth beyond where they have stagnated for far too long. It puts us back in control over our relationship with truth. We are not its slaves, but instead it is ours. It assists us when and only when we need it, with no unnecessary strings attached. We need to reevaluate our view of truth. We need to understand that truth exists to serve us, and that untruth and illusion are not necessarily useless. We need to understand that true and useful are not synonyms. This is fundamentally a matter of both epistemology and morality. It is very complex, and there is a lot more to this topic than what I have delved into here. Having said that, I think I have provided a strong defense of illusions and untruths. Ask not what is true, ask what is useful.